వెల్కమ్ టు మన టీవీ తెలంగాణ. గురుకులాల్లో ఉద్యోగాల్లోని భాగంగా నేడు ఇంకా 29-30 తారీఖులో జరగవలసినటువంటి గ్రంథపాలకులది, అదేవిధంగా నర్సింగ్, అదేవిధంగా ఆర్ట్ అండ్ క్రాఫ్ట్ టీచర్కి సంబంధించినటువంటి గైడెన్స్లో భాగంగా నేడు సంతోష్ గారు ఆర్ట్ నిపుణులు మనకు ఈరోజు మోడర్న్ ఆర్ట్ ఆఫ్ ఇండియా అనే టాపిక్ మీద వారితో డిస్కస్ చేయడం జరుగుతుంది. సంతోష్ గారు, వెల్కమ్ టు మన టీవీ తెలంగాణ. And Santosh ji, shall I ask questions regarding Ravi Verma paintings and one more thing, Gemini Roy, what is the nationalism paintings, what is the connection with the Ravi Verma painting? Can you explain to the people?
Yeah, thank you. Before going into these people like Ravi Verma, Gemini Roy and other artists, I think we need to understand what is modern art in India, right? Because if we define modern art as a concept, it comes from the West, and if we look at modern art in India, it slightly differs. And before getting into the idea of what is the difference, if you look at the definition of a simplistic definition of modern art, what is modern art? It would be like this. It is about painting representing what you see around. Okay, it is not about painting angels. It is not about painting gods whom you don't see, right? It is about what you see around you, right? That is what is considered to be modern art. And when you see it, what you experience. So the artist would experience, and that comes through his painting, his artwork, right? So when it comes to India, it kind of differs, because like modernism that came to India, and the modernism in India is different from what existed in Europe. Similarly, modern art in India also has a difference from modern art in the West. And the difference, like modern art is what you paint, what you see, paint what you see, represent what you see, and not about tradition. So modern art is basically, modernism itself is basically a move away from the tradition. It's a departure from the tradition, right? Which is why we become modern, which is why it is modern, right? So in the context of modern art also, it is a departure from the tradition, the departure from the traditional representation, right? But if you look at, as you said, Ravi Verma to begin with, if you look at the modern artists from mid-19th century, it is in the 19th century where we see modern art evolves in India, right? If we look at modern art from the mid-19th century, because before that what we have is a sort of an interesting historical transformation, where in India we never had a practice of hanging painting in the drawing room. We never had a practice of experiencing the painting, because painting, sculpture, or whatever art form was always part of certain kind of a religious practice or a social practice or some kind of a cultural practice, all right? So it is through colonialism, through modernism that enters India, that the practice of hanging a painting in the drawing room or whatever in the house takes place. Okay, so before that what we have, if you know, like you know miniature practices, right? Different kind of folk paintings, different kind of temple sculpture, right? So in that they are always attached with either architecture, or if it is a miniature, it is part of the folio, it is part of the book, right? So it is with Ravi Verma we get to see painting in a sort of a squarish format, in a sort of a format where you can hang it on the wall, right? It is with Ravi Verma that kind of a practice starts, right? Which he introduced a particular kind of a practice which could be called a modern practice for India, right? Where though he painted traditional themes, and we will see that now, right? Though he painted traditional themes, he sort of painted in a visual language, painted in a pictorial language, painted with a sort of a figures, color, light and shade, which was very new for India, right, which was not existing in India, and only you have artists coming from Europe, coming from Britain, they were painting. And Ravi Verma was the first Indian artist of Indian origin, who was born in India. Right? He started painting in oils, oil painting. Before that, artists, whoever artisans were in India, they were painting in watercolor, they were painting in tempera. Right? It is Ravi Verma who introduced oil painting, and in the easel format. If you know what an easel painting is, which is different from a watercolor painting. Right? So this format was introduced by Ravi Verma, and we will look at Ravi Verma now, what Ravi Verma is, where did he come from. Right? He, as you can see here on the slide, so he belonged to a very aristocratic family of Travancore, right? And his mother was a poet and father was a scholar, right? So you can see from the very beginning, when he was growing up, he got to hear about certain cultural stories, mythological stories of India. So through his mother as well as father, he sort of got certain kind of a cultural upbringing which helped him in developing certain interests in culture and tradition, right? So I'm sure we all know Ravi Verma. I'm sure everybody knows Ravi Verma because he's a very famous painter, right? And he painted beautiful figures, right? So he's the first artist. He's the first artist who almost gave a body, almost gave figure and face to the mythological goddesses and gods, right? He's the first artist, and he painted Mahabharata, stories from Mahabharata and Ramayana extensively, and we know that, right? You can and all the kind of oleographs that you have, the gods and goddesses of the calendars and different kinds of pictures that we have in our houses, they were kind of imagined by Ravi Verma. Ravi Verma gave shape to these, form, shape and face to these gods and goddesses whom we imagined, right? Till then, we did not have any, physical appearance of gods and goddesses. Now one can ask, how can you say this? Because we have them in the temples, we have them in the other kinds of folk paintings. But what happens with Ravi Verma is, he gave a particular kind of realistic figure. Okay, that we will see how. And he is an artist who did not go to an art school. There were no art schools when he started, right? He is an artist who did not go to the art school. He learned on his own, and his uncle was very helpful. He learned the basic watercolor painting from his uncle, Ramaswamy Naidu, and he encouraged Ravi Verma to go to Travancore. And then at that time in Travancore, a Dutch portrait painter was there, okay, who was painting portraits of princes and princes of Travancore court. So he was there stationed for over 6 months in Travancore. He's called Theodor Jensen. Okay, he was painting in oil painting on easel. Okay, so Ravi Verma was very interested, and he asked for his permission to kind of observe when Theodor Jensen was painting. So Theodor Jensen agreed to it, and he said, okay, fine, you can come and observe as I paint. So Ravi Verma learnt oil painting by observing, okay, by observing Theodor Jensen when he was painting, okay, portraits. So from that, so he's a sort of a self-taught artist. He didn't have a training, a sort of an academic training like the later artists would have. Okay, so this is one of the examples of his painting, and this is the uncle. Okay, he actually encouraged him. Initially he taught how to paint to Ravi Verma in watercolors and the basic technique, and later he sort of inspired him and encouraged him to go and learn from Theodor Jensen. And Ravi Verma also tried to learn from the Thanjavur painting. So Thanjavur painting, if you actually look at Ravi Verma's painting, the way he treats jewelry comes from Thanjavur painting experience, right? So Ravi Verma learns from Theodor Jensen on his own, like by observing Theodor Jensen. And if you look at this painting, it is again Ravi Verma starts painting the people that he comes across in the court, right? Like if we go back to the definition of modern art, you paint what you see, what we look around, what we get to see around. So Ravi Verma got to see these people, these figures, these aristocratic people. So he started painting these people, and these became these the court member, the family member members, the aristocratic family members became the first models for Ravi Verma to study. And if you know, and I'm sure you know, that artists learn from studying the models, right? Figure drawings, how do you draw a human figure? And all this learning he got from by painting the people of the Travancore family, Travancore court family, right? So this is one of the examples where he is painting the matriarch of Nair clan, right, with her granddaughter. And this is oil on canvas. And if you look at this, you have the light and shade here, the expression, right? You have the sense of body, the sense of flesh, right? The sense of a feeling that, you know, the actual people are standing over there, right, in flesh and blood. And the way the flesh and blood is painted is different from the way the cloths are painted, and the way the cloths are painted are different from the way jewelry is painted, right? So the knowledge of the detailed knowledge of such kind of a painting, you know, such the manner of painting, Ravi Verma acquired, right? And this is for the first time you can see Indian viewers, Indian people were getting to see, right? Yeah, this is another example, and he won a gold medal at Madras, because they used to have annual exhibitions in Madras as well as Bombay. So Ravi Verma earned several gold medals, several awards, and particularly gold medals, and this is one of the examples of his achievement, and it is 1873, Nair lady at her toilet, right? And he at the same time was you know, looking at and studying from different references from the European art, okay, from the magazines that he was getting, okay. So this is another example of his painting, and I'm sure you must have seen this painting, Shakuntala writing a letter to her beloved, Dushyanta. So if you look at this painting, it looks like a setting. You know, we don't get to see, you know, people like this naturally in our everyday life. It looks like a setting. And Ravi Verma took inspiration from Parsi theatre, particularly Farsi theatre, and he was witnessing theatre, he visited theatre, and the kind of dramatic quality that he saw in Parsi theatre, that quality comes into his painting, right? So Parsi theatre plays an important role in Ravi Verma's language, visual language of painting. Apart from Parsi theatre, he also learned this particular language, this particular visual representation of painting, he took from Neoclassical painting in Europe. Okay, if you know Neoclassical painting, or if you don't know, you should know. I mean, you can try knowing what is Neoclassical painting. So he takes his visual language, his ways of painting, his ways of drawing figure, and ways of light, treating light and shade. He takes from Neoclassical painting. So 2 points are clear here. One is the Neoclassical painting of Europe, another is the Farsi theatre. So these 2 points are important here, where these two kind of come together in Ravi Verma's painting, right? So Ravi Verma, as a self-taught artist, he learns on his own by observing Theodor Jensen when he was painting, and then later by referring to books and magazines, he learned the ways of neoclassical painting, and by observing Harsi theatre, right. So this is another example, right. Here comes Papa, and you see the kind of light, the light that falls on the central figure, right. And how that light makes the central figure more important to look at, and how this light is a theatrical light. This light is something that we don't see in a general common experience, but you see this in theater, and this is a sort of a testimony, this is a sort of an example where we can say he took influences from theater. Another interesting reference is this photograph where his daughter was holding her son, and she got photographed. And at that point of time, studio photography was very much in practice, and many of the upper class, many of the aristocratic families used to get photographed like this. So photography has a different practice, but it also helped Ravi Verma. For our discussion here, Ravi Verma took help from the photographic practices also, which is another important point. And later, Ravi Verma was an itinerant artist. Ravi Verma was an artist who used to travel from one court to another. He was invited by Mysore Palace, he was invited by Baroda, and this is a painting that he did when he was in Baroda, invited by the Baroda Maharaja. Right? He painted 10 oil paintings of mythological figures and gods and goddesses, and this Saraswati that he painted was in Baroda. And if you look at this, what you see here is Saraswati is sitting on a rock, and you have a landscape at the back, as if you feel as if the actual goddess is sitting in front of you. This new experience is something that Ravi Verma provided through his painting. Okay, and this is another example of Lakshmi. We haven't seen Lakshmi in her actual look. So the actual look, that how gods and goddesses might appear, right, on earth. So that is something that Ravi Verma, created for the people, like Gaja Lakshmi, Lakshmi standing on the lotus, and you have a sort of a very serene, picturesque, and very calm landscape at the back. This also he painted in Baroda, right. So Ravi Verma, what Ravi Verma did is he sort of humanized the gods and goddesses, right. He sort of contemporized. Contemporized means that you make God and goddess look like as if they belong to our time, as if they belong to what we live in, our actual time and space in our region, right. So which is why you see Ravi Verma's Lakshmi or Saraswati are wearing saris, right, and the saris that he painted, the kind of figures that he painted initially, if you remember, in the Travancore court, right. So he contemporized gods and goddesses, and he gave a human feel. He gave a sort of a human feel to the gods and goddesses, right. So he started a oleographic press in Bombay, in Lonavala, in the 1890s, right. So till now, Ravi Verma's paintings were collected by the aristocratic families, either Maharajas or people who could afford to buy his oil paintings, because the middle class and the lower class could not afford to own a painting because they were very costly. So he started in the 1895, 94, 95, he started an oleographic press. Oleograph is nothing but a sort of a multiple print making technique. Okay, like we have calendars now, like calendars of gods and goddesses and different kinds of calendars that you hang in the in your houses, and particularly gods and goddesses that you have in your home, shrine, small temple that you might have at your home. So Ravi Verma started to reproduce, to transform his oil paintings into oleographs, and you see on the left side, as you have seen earlier, it is the Saraswati painted in oil, right, painted in oil for Baroda Maharaja. And in the late 90s, he transformed the same Saraswati in the technique of oleograph. So in oleograph you can have some 1,000 copies of the same, and you know you have number of Lakshmis, a number of Saraswatis. So that people, people in the society of middle class, lower middle class, so they can own the same image now, right? So this is how Ravi Verma made this particular gods and goddesses and the mythological stories. He made very popular, right? So Ravi Verma, which is why he is a very popular artist in India. Unlike any other artist, Ravi Verma became popular because of the oleographic reproductions that he did, right? And the drama, the melodrama and the theatricality that I was mentioning earlier, and you can see here also the kind of theatrical expressions, theatrical lighting, theatrical effect, the effect of theater, so if you actually watch this kind of a Parsi theater, you would know that what kind of created effects, created expressions are sort of given. I'm sure I'm not going into the actual stories, and these are coming from Mahabharata and Ramayana largely, and I hope I assume we all know the stories, and I don't want to spend time on it. This is his last painting, and you know the story, and this is a beautiful painting where he captured the movement, the animation, the way the wing of the Jatayu is falling, and the way both Ravana and Sita are raising up, this kind of a counter movement within the painting he has created, and the kind of light that is coming from the background and hitting, So the entire dramatization is also affected by the light and the way the light is used. So this is another artist, Abanindranath Tagore. Okay, we have seen from the mid 19th century to the early 20th century how Ravi Verma has painted traditional, right? He painted traditional themes, epics, right? But in a language which was new to India, in a pictorial language, in a painterly language, in a visual language which was very new to India, right? And he was praised because he was the first artist who has shown to the world the richness and the greatness of Indian tradition, the Indian mythology, right? And the next artist is Abanindranath Tagore, and Tagore from Calcutta. He is considered to be the first nationalist painter, right? So Ravi Verma has shown to the world and to Indian people, he had shown the richness and the greatness of Indian tradition and its mythology, but he had shown it in a European language, in a foreign language, right? So that was the kind of criticism that emerged. Ravi Verma was criticized by 1870s, 1880s. Ravi Verma criticized by saying that he painted in a language which is Western, which is not Indian. And you should remember at this point that this was the time where the nationalist movement, for Indian independence, the nationalist movement was coming together. Slowly, you have the nationalists, the people got a consciousness about the greatness of India, and they started kind of thinking about our nation, thinking about, thinking in a nationalist terms, thinking in terms of what is the greatness of our nation, and we should show, we should speak, we should represent India and its greatness in our language, right? So then there is this, they emerged this understanding, they came to this understanding that, East, because India East is spiritual, West is material. So this kind of a distinction emerged in the 1870s, 1880s and 90s, that continues, right. This happened, and because of this, Ravi Verma, though he was painting about the greatness of Indian tradition, Indian mythology and art, he was criticized because he was painting in a language which is material, not spiritual. So he was criticized, saying that his paintings did not have the spiritual quality that India has. So gradually, with these ideas, Abanindranath was influenced, and he became a next important artist, right. So he started referring, unlike Ravi Verma, he started referring to the miniatures, right, the Rajasthani miniatures and the Rajput miniatures and the medieval miniatures, right, which is why you can see in the slide, his painting is very much like a miniature. It's not like oil painting. It's not like what Ravi Verma painted, right. So Abanindranath Tagore wanted to bring back the pure spiritual quality that existed in India, before British, which is why he went looking at the Indian traditional painting, right, for his reference, and not the European painting, unlike Ravi Verma, right. So this is the time where the height of nationalism was, emerging. People were influenced by the nationalist ideas and the spiritual dimensions of nationalism, right. So he was influenced, Abanindranath Tagore was influenced by four key figures, okay, four key Orientalists, right. E.B. Hewell, Kumaraswamy, Sister Nivedita, and E.B. Hewell, Kumaraswamy, Sister Nivedita, and and another key figure was Okakura Kakuzo, right, who was a Japanese, right. In Japan also, at that point of time, there was a height of nationalism happening, right, that also reflected in art, right. So this entire movement, this entire sort of nationalist movement rejected the Western materialistic culture, right. So they rejected the European realism. What we see in Ravi Verma, the kind of realism, they rejected it, and they looked back to the spiritual aspects of Indian painting that existed before the coming of British into India, right. So Abanindranath Tagore went back into tradition in a different approach. So if we go back to the earlier definition that we had about modern art, where modern art is a departure from tradition for the West, for Indians, modern art is not a departure, but it is a reapproach to the tradition. We are not, if you look at these two artists, and we can see later also, they are not initially, they are not departing from tradition. They are not saying that we won't look at mythology, we won't look at Krishna, we won't look at Rama, whatever, but they are actually approaching mythology and tradition and traditional forms and kind of refiguring, reinterpreting, re-representing in a different location, in a different situation, in a different time, for a different purpose of nationalism, right. So this is very important for us to understand why and how Indian modern art is different from the idea of modern art in the West. Okay, this is something very crucial one needs to keep in mind, right. So Okakura Kakuzo visits India, and he spent some time in Calcutta with Abanindranath Tagore, and when he went back, he sent two of his artists, two of his students, and they stayed with Abanindranath Tagore in his studio, and here an interaction happened between these two artists, Yokoyama Taikan and Hishida Shunzo. Okay, these two artists interacted with Abanindranath Tagore, and there evolved a very interesting technique called wash technique. So Abanindranath Tagore invented this technique using the knowledge of miniature painting as well as the knowledge of Japanese painting, Japanese calligraphic painting. Okay, so by using these two techniques, he invented a technique called wash painting. Okay, and he paints in that technique throughout his life. And this is one of his paintings. Abanindranath Tagore painted Rabindranath Tagore, his uncle, right? And this is how Abanindranath Tagore was trained in the actual neoclassical sort of a realistic sort of a language, right? Very much closer to what we have seen in Ravi Verma. But what happens with the kind of influences that he got through Hegel, through Okakura, and through other Orientalist thinkers, through Kumaraswamy, he shifted from that language to a more miniature kind of language, right? So, in the early 19th century, before 1905, in 1903, 1902, he was gifted by a manuscript of Irish ballads, and that became a very influential example for him, and a folio of Delhi Kala miniatures. So, miniature practice was happening at that point of time. Very few. Mughal dynasty was not there, no court patronage was there, but these artists were trying to kind of paint and survive in their own. And that particular miniature album Abanindranath Tagore got. And after that you see this kind of a change from, for example, from this, you know, where you have a sort of a realistic appeal in terms of light, shade and form, he moves to this kind of a miniature kind of language, right? And this he painted in oil, though, but it is about Shah Jahan and the death of Shah Jahan, you know, passing of Shah Jahan, and Shah Jahan is looking at Taj Mahal in the deep. If you look at this painting, the painting is structured, it looks like a miniature, but it's structured with the knowledge of perspective. You just keep these points in mind and maybe you can think about it. It is structured with the knowledge of perspective that we know from Renaissance, right? And this is a very crucial painting one needs to keep in mind for Abanindranath Tagore, which he painted in 1905. This is one of the first wash painting that he did in watercolor. Wash painting is done in watercolor. You apply the paint and you wash it, and you do it several times, 10 times, 20 times, whatever. What remains is the very fleeting effects of color, right? So, and with that you get a very interesting depth, and we will see some more images as we go ahead. So, this he painted during the partition of Bengal, right? 1905, Bengal was was divided into West and East Bengal. So, as a moment of protest, as an expression of protest, he painted this image where you have Bharat Mata standing in saffron and holding you know, palm leaves in one hand. On 4 hands you have like 4 things that she is holding, and this was a very influential image and, you know, very inspirational image at that point of time. This is another example where he painted his own mother, but if you look at, for example, compare this with what he painted of Rabindranath Tagore, the portrait of Rabindranath Tagore. That was very different. If you go back and see, it's very different. It's very European, but this is more, it's more like a miniature effect, right? So this is very interesting, and this is important for us to understand and keep in mind. Why is this happening? This is happening because of the nationalist ideology, the nationalist movement, and here the wash technique, watercolor, becomes very important. It is not just a medium of painting, but it is a medium of Indian origin. That was the kind of idea. And this is again another painting. This looks very close to what you see in Far Eastern painting. So he was very much influenced by Far Eastern painting. As you know, 2 of the artists were there in his studio, and he learned Far Eastern painting from them. So he created this very melancholic, intense sort of images, okay, very fleeting, very lyrical, right? This is very hazy, but you know, so it's very different from what you have seen in Ravi Verma, right? And again, the question of modern art, and modern art, you paint what you feel like. The feeling of the artist is very important. So you get to see that sense of melancholy, the sense of that, you know, the brooding feeling, the emotional feeling in this. This is one of his late paintings, Sindbad the Sailor. He painted a series called Arabian Nights, and this is one of the paintings from Arabian Nights, where Sindbad, and I'm sure we all know Sindbad the Sailor, these Arabian Nights stories. We get to see them in TVs and we get to read them. This is a moment when Sindbad finished his travel. He became very old, and he's sitting there, right, in the white garment, right? He's very old, and you have a young boy accompanied by Sindbad, listening very carefully, very attentively to what Sindbad is telling, the stories of his travel. And you have a boat at the back, which is very symbolic. It looks like a painting. It is not an actual boat. It actually looks like a painting. And on both the sides, you have different kinds of people belonging to different ethnic groups. You have a Muslim, you have a European sitting there, you have a Chinese, you have a Farsi, you have a Hindu. So on either sides, you have people representing different ethnic groups, right? So it is not about Sindbad actually, it is about what was happening in Calcutta in the early 20th century, the kind of cosmopolitan nature, the kind of people that were there. And the interesting observation one can have here, the interesting element is European guy, the Britisher is sitting on a sort of a table, on a sort of a so that's how you get to see them sitting at that point of time. So it is Arabian Nights is a series where he painted more about what he was seeing around, which is again the point of modern art. What he was seeing around Calcutta, his own experiences, but he was telling the narrative, he was telling the story through the through this particular fiction called Arabian Nights. This is another artist. Okay, so you have Ravi Verma. After Ravi Verma being criticized, by the late 19th century, and he was replaced by the achievements of Abanindranath Tagore, right, at the heights of nationalist movement. And Amrita Shergill comes little later, and Amrita Shergill criticizes what Bengal school was doing. And I just forgot to mention that Abanindranath Tagore was head of something called Bengal School. He established a sort of a small group called Bengal School of Painting, which was earlier called as the New Indian Painting. So it was later renamed as Bengal School Painting. So we know Abanindranath Tagore and his students and their painting as Bengal School art. So she criticized Bengal School painting, saying that it is, it is in the past, they talk about past, they paint about past, they don't paint about what you see actually. So she is an interesting artist where she was born in Budapest. She was born to a Hungarian mother and a Punjabi father. So she was born not in India but in Budapest, in Europe. And this is her quote, and it's a very interesting quote, and this tells a lot about her. I am an individualist evolving a new technique which, though not necessarily Indian in traditional sense of the word, right? She's saying it is not necessarily Indian in traditional sense of the word, will yet be fundamentally Indian in spirit. So she's kind of proposing a different idea of spirit rather than a spirit that is rooted in Indian soil, but she's talking about more spiritual aspect of the spirit rather than the location, with the eternal significance of form and color. So she is combining form and color with the spirit rather than spirit existing in the Rajput painting or the the actual painting that Abanindranath Tagore has looked at. So she is the kind of a painter who started painting like this, where she was studying in an art college in Paris, which is a famous art college where many of the artists, modern Western artists, have studied, École des Beaux Arts. Okay, she studied there, and she was influenced by the kind of painting that was taught in that art school, and this is the kind of kind of language, kind of painting that was taught, and she was influenced by few major modern artists called Gauguin, Paul Cézanne, and her teacher Lucien Simon, and several other post-impressionist artists. you might get to hear this term later, or you might have to research into it to know what post-impressionism is. Post-impressionism in the 19th century in France, spread throughout Europe, and she was trained in that particular way of painting, method of painting, right? Comes to India with that kind of a knowledge of painting. She was spiritually Indian. She mentioned several times, and yeah. So this is another example of her painting, where she painted two young girls, and this again got a gold medal for her. Like this, she got an award for this. And this is again a post-impressionist language. This is a language which is considered to be the Western language, post-impressionist language of the 20th century. So what happens when she comes to India? She comes to India and then she looks at people for the first time, you know. So she starts painting Indian people. So you can see she was staying in Shimla. She was a Punjabi, right? So she was staying in Shimla and she painted these Punjabi girls, you know, 3 Punjabi girls. And you can note the difference between this and this. This is very much European in terms of light, in terms of dress, of the flesh tint, and in terms of all the details. This, you can see the Punjabi costumes and Punjabi, the Indian physiognomy and the color and the treatment, you know. It's very different from what you saw in the earlier slide. So this difference is happening because of her influence that she has taken from, right? So she traveled to Ajanta and Ellora. I'm sure you will get to know what is Ajanta and Ellora, and we all know what Ajanta is, Ajanta paintings, and the greatness of Ajanta paintings and sculpture and Ellora sculpture, right? She traveled to Ajanta, she looked at different miniature paintings, she traveled to the southern India, and then she saw many temple miniatures. So even here you can see there are how she changed from her post-impressionist Western language to a sort of a more individualized, more personal, you know, more personal language, where a sort of a stylization, she kind of got into a sort of a stylization of figures. The stylization is influenced by the Ajanta painting, by the Rajput miniatures, right? So you can see this is, if you just go back, you know, look at the way the head is drawn, look at the way the figures are drawn. If you look back, very different, right? So this is happening because of a certain kind of an approach and understanding and learning from Ajanta, learning from the Indian traditional painting. So she approached Indian traditional art differently from what Abanindranath Tagore was doing, right? She was not sort of emulating, not sort of working, painting in such a way that it looks like a miniature. She is not doing that. She is sort of taking elements and using them and making a personal language. And this personal individual language is something that which is very important to the concept of modern art. Modern art deals with the idea of the individual language, individual personal language of the artist, and that is what she was trying to do in these paintings, right? So this is a painting that she did at a later stage in her life. She died very young at 28, and you look at the color here, the color is very different, you know, and the facial tint, the pigment, the skin tone is very different from what you saw in the earlier first painting. This is another artist called Jamini Roy, and we'll try to wind up with this artist. You have seen Ravi Verma, who was painting in a language of European painting, Neoclassical painting, but he painted Indian gods and goddesses and themes from Indian mythology. You have seen Abanindranath Tagore, who sort of painted in a visual language and technique which was considered to be very Indian, right? Miniature influence, and then used watercolor, not oils. He shifted from oils. He was trained in oils, but he shifted from oils to watercolor and continued painting in watercolor, but in a language which looked more Indian. And you have seen Amrita Shergill coming from a different location, coming from as a European. She was born as a European and had experiences of being a European there. studied in the European art school and comes to India, and she sort of imbibes, she takes elements from Ajanta and other Indian traditional painting, and she evolves a different language altogether, personal language. And you have Jamini Roy, who was again another interesting artist who came from Bengal, West Bengal, who was born in a district called Bankura in West Bengal, and he studied in Government School of Art. In the mid-19th century, in the 1850s, British government established art schools in India. Okay, it is in the mid-19th century you have art schools being established in India, and after that you have major 4 art schools where Calcutta, in major 4 cities, one in Calcutta, one in Bombay, one in Madras, and one in Lahore little later. But these were established, and Jamini Roy studied his art in Calcutta Art School, and he got his diploma in 1908. He is the artist who was trained in the classical tradition of, academic classical tradition of painting classical nudes, painting Greek sculpture and Greek painting, but he moves into a different direction. So these are the examples, as you can see. Just you should remember these examples where he's painting these images, these landscapes in a more quote unquote post-impressionist language, and you can connect this with Amrita Shergill's painting, right? The way the brush application, the color application, the brush movement, the roughness of painting and all are more closer to what you can see in Amrita Shergill. What happens later is he gradually shifts into a more Indian kind of a language. Along with this kind of a painting, he was also trained in something like this, which is considered to be the Indian painting, Indian school of painting, right? So where he learned wash painting and tempera and Indian technique. Tempera, where it is done in watercolor, is considered to be Indian technique. So this is another kind of painting that he did, 1920, right? So by combining these two, he moves into a direction which is very different from quote unquote Indian painting or quote unquote the Western painting, Western ways of painting or Indian ways of painting, right? So this is an example which is a transition from those two categories into a new method of painting that he gets into, right? So a new kind of stylization that he learns from largely folk art, right? And Bankura, where he came from, Bankura is a place where you have extensive number of folk and tribal art, folk art, and you have impressive terracotta temples, right? So from the very beginning of his childhood, he got to see different forms of folk art, and after he finished his graduation, after he finished his art training in Government School of Art, Calcutta, he was very closely influenced by something called Kalighat painting. Kalighat painting was a painting practice which existed in Kali temple, and I'm sure you all know Kalighat is a place where you have this very famous Kali temple in Calcutta. So at that point of time, from early 19th century onwards, you have few folk painters coming there and stationing there, sitting there and doing these paintings, right? So these folk painters were otherwise painting in a different format, right? So these folk painters came there and they had a huge market because Kali temple was very famous. Like if you go to any temple, you go buy something as a souvenir, you buy a photograph of, if you go to Tirupati or if you go anywhere, you go buy something, right? So people were buying these paintings when they were coming to Kali temple. So they became very famous and popular. And Jamini Roy, after getting his training, he was very much attracted to this tradition. And on the right, you can see here on the screen, Kalighat painting. I have only one painting. You can get to see more online if you want. I have one painting, and on the left you have a painting done by Jamini Roy, right? So you can see how closely he has taken the influences from Kalighat painting and he moved away from his academic training. He moved away from his Western kind of a painting, and he continued painting in this kind of a very folkish language of painting. Particularly, you know, this is something called Santal dance. He painted different kinds of themes. He had no hangover. He had no baggage of, you know, nationalism. So he saw the identity of nation. It was very much Gandhian in one way. He saw the identity of nation in living traditions, in the living folk cultures, folk traditions, right, in the villages. So which is why you can see he adopted the folk way of painting also. He did not paint the entire painting. He used to draw and give it to the other people. They used to finish the painting, and finally he used to give the final touching. So the way he painted, produced the painting, was also was like a workshop, not like one painting, not like Ravi Verma painting the entire painting, right? So he painted different themes. You can see here Christ. So he was not only painting Hindu themes or Indian themes. So he was very holistic in one way, and interesting a painter. And many artists, you know, for example, K. Rajaya for, you know, Kapu Rajaya of Telangana, and various Srinivasulu, K. Srinivasulu, and various other artists have actually got inspiration from Gemini Roy. And he is the first artist who, and this is Last Supper, a very important Christian theme, but you know how he painted, right? Yeah, this is, you know, Ramayana, and very different from what you have seen in Ravi Verma, right? So Gemini Roy is someone who is very different from the other three artists, right? So I think we can see a sort of a trajectory where, you know, how each artist had a sort of an individual interest, and at the same time they were responding, they were taking and giving something to the time in which they were painting, right? So modern art evolves in this kind of a tension, pulls and pushes, but Indian art, Indian modern art, always dealt with the question of tradition. That is something that one needs to keep in mind. Thank you.
Okay, nice discussion on the oil paintings and holiographic, especially on Ravi Verma painting and Abhindranath Tagore, and another one miniatures and Tagore Galigat paintings and Amrita Shergill and Jamni Rai painting. Very nice discussion. Thank you, Mr. Santoshji. Next class we will discuss on next topic we will discuss on another class. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.